Mom, seriously, you're embarrassing yourself. My son Marcus stood in my kitchen doorway holding his phone like it contained evidence of my latest crime against humanity. The screen showed my TikTok account, all 47 followers of it, and the dance video I'd posted that morning. People your age don't belong on social media. It's cringy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I watched his face flush with that particular shade of mortification that only a 24-year-old can achieve when their mother dares to exist in the same digital space as them. What Marcus didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that in exactly 18 hours, that same cringy video would explode across every platform imaginable, racking up 2 million views and changing everything I thought I knew about myself, my capabilities, and what it means to be too old for anything. My name is Diana Chen, and at 58, I thought I had figured out my place in the world. After 32 years of teaching high school English in Portland, Oregon, I'd recently taken early retirement to care for my aging mother and finally tackle all those projects I'd been putting off. The empty nest was still an adjustment. Marcus had graduated from Oregon State 2 years earlier and moved back home while job hunting, though his hunting seemed to involve more scrolling through his phone than actual applications. The irony wasn't lost on me that my son, who spent roughly 14 hours a day staring at various screens, was lecturing me about appropriate digital behavior. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the real story isn't just about a viral video. It's about what happens when someone decides you're past your expiration date, and you have to choose whether to accept that verdict or prove them spectacularly wrong. It started 6 months earlier, in February, when I was cleaning out the spare bedroom that had served as my unofficial storage unit for the past decade. Between boxes of lesson plans and outdated teaching materials, I found my old college journals, pages and pages of poetry I'd written in my early 20s, back when I thought I might become the next Maya Angelou instead of a suburban English teacher. Reading those poems felt like meeting a stranger who happened to look exactly like me. The voice was mine but bolder, more willing to take risks. I'd forgotten that version of myself existed. The woman who'd performed at coffee shop open mics, who'd submitted pieces to literary magazines, who'd believed her words could change something in the world beyond her classroom. That rediscovery coincided with my mother's suggestion that I join her on social media. "All the ladies at the senior center are on this TikTok now," she announced one afternoon, scrolling through videos on the tablet Marcus had reluctantly set up for her. "You should try it, Diana. You always were the creative one in the family." Marcus, who was sprawled on our living room couch conducting his daily ritual of applying to 3 jobs while watching 17 TikToks, snorted with derision. "Mom's not exactly TikTok material, Grandma. That's for people who actually understand how the internet works." The dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent 3 decades helping teenagers navigate complex literature, teaching them to analyze poetry and express themselves through writing. I'd adapted to every new technology that entered my classroom, from overhead projectors to smartboards to online learning platforms during the pandemic. But somehow, in Marcus's eyes, I'd become technologically incompetent the moment I turned 50. That night, I downloaded TikTok on the phone Marcus had convinced me to upgrade the previous Christmas. "It's easier if you just have the newest iPhone, Mom." Trust me. The setup process was more intuitive than I'd expected, and within an hour I was scrolling through an endless stream of content that ranged from brilliant to baffling. What struck me wasn't the dancing teenagers or the elaborate cooking videos, but the poets. Real poets, sharing their work in 30-second clips, reaching audiences that traditional literary magazines could only dream of. Women my age and older, speaking their truths directly into their phone cameras, garnering hundreds of thousands of views for pieces about divorce, aging, rediscovering themselves after decades of putting everyone else first. I spent that entire weekend watching poetry TikToks, taking notes like I was preparing for a lecture. I studied the timing, the pacing, the way successful creators used pauses and inflection to maximize impact. By Sunday evening, I had a revelation. This wasn't just social media. This was a new form of performance poetry, as legitimate as any coffee shop stage I'd stood on 35 years earlier. My first video was a disaster. I'd chosen one of my old college poems about autumn leaves, filmed it in the harsh fluorescent light of my kitchen, and posted it at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. It received 4 views, 2 of which were probably from my own phone when I kept checking to see if anyone had watched it. The comments section remained brutally empty, but I wasn't discouraged. If anything, the lack of response felt familiar. I'd submitted dozens of poems to literary journals in my 20s, collecting rejection slips like other people collected coffee mugs. The difference was that this rejection was public, quantified in real time by an algorithm that seemed designed to humble anyone over the age of 25. I spent the next month learning the platform's unspoken rules. Post between 6 and 10 p.m. for maximum visibility. Use trending audio when possible. Keep videos under 30 seconds. Hashtag strategically, but not desperately. Most importantly, be authentic. The algorithm could somehow detect performative authenticity from 3 miles away. My follower count grew slowly but steadily. I attracted other middle-aged women who were experimenting with creative expression, retired teachers who appreciated my classroom home delivery style, and a surprising number of younger users who seemed genuinely interested in intergenerational perspectives on universal themes like loss, identity, and starting over. The breakthrough came when I wrote a poem about feeling invisible after 50. It was raw, honest, and born from a grocery store encounter where a teenage cashier had looked right through me while chatting with the 20-something customer behind me in line. The piece was called The Vanishing Act, and it explored how society conditions women to fade gracefully into the background once we're no longer considered sexually or professionally relevant. I filmed it in my backyard garden, using the natural golden hour lighting I'd learned, created the most flattering effect. I wore the emerald green cardigan that Marcus had given me for my birthday, the one he'd chosen because it brings out your eyes, Mom. My delivery was measured, conversational, like I was sharing a secret with my closest friend. The poem began, "They tell us 50 is the new 30, but nobody mentions the new invisibility that comes with the territory. How the world suddenly develops selective blindness when you walk into a room." I posted it on a Thursday evening and went to bed thinking it might reach my usual audience of 50 to 100 viewers. I'd grown comfortable with that scale. Small but engaged, quality over quantity. Friday morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing incessantly. The video had 50,000 views and 800 comments. By noon, it had hit 200,000 views. By evening, it had crossed 500,000, with comments pouring in from women around the world sharing their own experiences of middle-aged invisibility. The most heartbreaking responses came from women in their 40s and 50s who described feeling erased by their own families, treated as though their prime contribution to society was over simply because they'd reached a certain birthday. But there were also comments from younger viewers expressing surprise and gratitude, admitting they'd never.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Considered what their mothers and grandmothers might be experiencing internally. Marcus discovered my sudden internet fame when his coworker showed him the video, which had been shared to Instagram and Twitter by several accounts with millions of followers. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected, mortification mixed with grudging amazement. "Mom, you're everywhere," he said, scrolling through the reposts on his phone. "My friend Jake sent me this video, and I had to tell him it was my mother. Do you know how weird that is?" But I could see something else in his expression, a flicker of pride he was trying to suppress, mixed with genuine confusion about how his allegedly tech-illiterate mother had managed to create something that was resonating with hundreds of thousands of people. The success of The Vanishing Act opened doors I hadn't known existed. Other content creators began reaching out, inviting me to collaborate. A literary agent found me through TikTok and asked if I'd ever considered writing a book. Local news stations wanted to interview me about my unexpected social media success. What struck me most was how the narrative around my achievement kept focusing on its unexpectedness. Every headline emphasized my age, as though creating meaningful content after 50 was some sort of miraculous aberration. 58-year-old teacher goes viral, or grandmother becomes TikTok sensation. or retiree proves age is just a number. I understood the angle. It was legitimately unusual for someone my age to break through on a platform dominated by Gen Z users. But the constant emphasis on my age as the most remarkable thing about my success began to feel reductive. Nobody was calling 22-year-old viral creators young person becomes TikTok sensation. Their age was simply accepted as irrelevant to their ability to create compelling content. The attention was simultaneously exhilarating and overwhelming. I'd gone from posting to dozens of followers to having hundreds of thousands of people analyzing my every word. The pressure to replicate the success of The Vanishing Act was intense, especially as my follower count continued climbing toward 100,000. I tried different approaches. Some worked, some flopped spectacularly. A poem about divorce, I'd been divorced from Marcus's father for 8 years, resonated strongly with women navigating major life transitions. A piece about rediscovering creativity after decades of putting it aside hit 300,000 views. But a video about social media itself, which felt too meta even as I was recording it, barely cracked 10,000 views. The algorithm was a mystery I was slowly learning to decode. Success on TikTok wasn't just about content quality, it was about timing, luck, and some indefinable quality that made videos catch fire. I began to understand why younger creators talked about their social media presence like a full-time job. It was exhausting and addictive in equal measure. Marcus's attitude toward my online presence evolved gradually, from embarrassment to reluctant respect to something approaching genuine admiration. He started offering unsolicited advice about lighting and camera angles, drawing on his years of casual social media consumption to help me improve my technical presentation. "You should get a ring light, Mom, and maybe film vertical videos instead of square ones. The algorithm favors vertical." He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable with his own expertise. "Also, you should respond to more comments. Engagement drives visibility." It was strange, having my son become my informal social media consultant, but also touching. For the first time in months, we were collaborating on something instead of circling around his job search and my retirement anxiety like cautious diplomats. The turning point came when I decided to address the age issue directly. I'd been reading through comments on my videos, and while most were supportive, there was a persistent undercurrent of surprise that someone my age could create relevant content. The compliments, often backhanded, "This is so good for someone over 50," or "Wow, you're cooler than most people half your age." I appreciated the sentiment, but the phrasing bothered me. It reinforced the assumption that creativity and cultural relevance naturally declined with age, making any evidence to the contrary noteworthy rather than normal. So I wrote a piece called "The Expiration Date," about society's tendency to assign arbitrary deadlines to women's relevance, creativity, and right to take up space in conversations about contemporary culture. The poem challenged the notion that there was an age limit on reinvention, on learning new skills, on having something meaningful to contribute to cultural dialogues. The video was more confrontational than my usual content, directly questioning assumptions that many viewers probably hadn't examined critically. I knew it might alienate some of my audience, but it felt important to say explicitly what had been simmering beneath the surface of all my previous posts. I filmed it in my living room, wearing the same emerald cardigan from The Vanishing Act because several commenters had mentioned it favorably. The natural light from our large front window created the soft, even illumination I'd learned worked best for my skin tone. The poem opened with, "Someone decided I expired at 50, stamped my forehead with an invisible date that rendered my opinions, my creativity, my very presence somehow less valid than it was at 25. I talked about the absurdity of treating wisdom as worthlessness, experience as obsolescence. I addressed the comment section directly, thanking younger viewers for their support, while questioning why their surprise at my relevance revealed more about social conditioning than it did about my capabilities. The piece was angrier than my usual work, more political, more direct in its challenge to systemic ageism. I hesitated before posting it, wondering if I was risking the goodwill I'd built with my audience. But ultimately, I realized that if I was going to have a platform, I had an obligation to use it for more than just personal validation. I posted the expiration date on a Tuesday evening, my usual optimal posting time. Within the first hour, I could tell something different was happening. The engagement was more intense, more polarized. Comments were coming in faster than I could read them, with responses ranging from enthusiastic agreement to defensive pushback to analysis that was more sophisticated than I'd expected from a TikTok comment section. By Wednesday morning, the video had 100,000 views. By Thursday, it had crossed 500,000. But the real explosion happened over the weekend, when several prominent accounts with millions of followers reshared it with their own commentary about ageism in social media and society generally. Friday afternoon, Marcus burst through the front door with an expression I'd never seen before, something between amazement and panic. "Mom, you're on the news." Like, the actual news. He held up his phone, showing me a CNN segment about viral content creators challenging social norms. There I was, a screenshot from the expiration date, alongside creators discussing everything from body positivity to racial justice. "They called you an unlikely voice for intergenerational dialogue," he reported, scrolling through the coverage. "And look at this, you're trending on Twitter. People are using #expiration date to talk about ageism." The surreal nature of the situation hit me fully. 6 months earlier, I'd been a recently retired teacher with 47 TikTok followers, and my son had been lecturing me about staying in my digital lane. Now I was part of a national conversation about age, relevance, and who gets to participate in contemporary cultural discussions. The video eventually peaked at just over 2 million views across all the platforms where it was shared. More importantly, it sparked conversations that extended far beyond my comment section. Op-ed writers picked up the theme, discussing ageism in the workplace, in media representation, in the assumptions we make about who has valuable perspectives on modern life. I received messages from women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who said my video had inspired them to pursue creative projects they'd abandoned, to speak up in meetings where they'd been overlooked, to refuse to accept invisibility as the natural consequence of aging. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from younger viewers who admitted they'd internalized ageist assumptions without realizing it. College students wrote to thank me for helping them see their mothers and grandmothers differently. Young professionals described having more substantive conversations with older colleagues after watching my videos. The success of the expiration date led to opportunities I never could have imagined. Publishers reached out about book deals. Speaking bureaus wanted to book me for conferences about digital literacy and creative aging. Several universities invited me to guest lecture about social media as a tool for intergenerational communication. Most surprisingly, brands began approaching me for sponsorship deals. Companies selling everything from skincare to financial services wanted to partner with me, recognizing that women over 50 represented a huge underserved market with significant spending power. Marcus watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and amusement. One evening, as I was responding to collaboration requests from my laptop, he shook his head and laughed. "Remember when you asked me to help you set up your email account because you thought you'd broken the internet?" he said. "Now you're getting offered more money for one sponsored post than I make in a month at my new job." He'd finally found employment at a Portland marketing firm, partly, he admitted, because his experience helping me navigate social media had given him practical skills his interviewers found valuable. "It's weird," he continued, "but kind of cool that my mom is internet famous. My coworkers all follow you now. They think you're hilarious." The relationship between us had shifted fundamentally. Instead of him tolerating my technological incompetence, he'd become genuinely interested in my creative process. He'd suggest topics for videos, help me brainstorm hashtag strategies, and offer honest feedback about which pieces worked and which fell flat. But the real change wasn't in his respect for my social media skills. It was in his recognition that I was still evolving as a person, still capable of surprising him, still learning and growing in ways that didn't fit his assumptions about what people my age should be doing with their time. The viral success also changed how I saw myself. For years, I'd defined my identity primarily through my roles as a teacher, a mother, a caregiver. Retirement had felt like stepping into a void, wondering what purpose I could serve now that those primary roles had ended or diminished. Social media, ironically, had given me a new sense of purpose and connection. I was reaching more people with my writing than I ever had as a teacher. I was contributing to conversations about topics I cared about. I was proving to myself and others that creativity doesn't have an expiration date, that relevance isn't automatically revoked when you turn 50. The platform also connected me with a community I hadn't known existed. Other women navigating the complex transition of middle age, rediscovering parts of themselves they'd set aside during decades of putting everyone else's needs first. We shared advice, celebrated each other's successes, and created a support network that transcended geographical boundaries. 6 months after the expiration date went viral, I was invited to speak at a conference about digital creativity and aging. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience that included people from their 20s to their 80s, I thought about Marcus's initial reaction to my first clumsy attempts at TikTok. "People your age don't belong on social media," he'd said, as if there were invisible velvet ropes around digital spaces, keeping out anyone who remembered life before the internet. But belonging isn't about age. It's about having something to say and finding the courage to say it. It's about refusing to accept other people's limitations on your potential. It's about recognizing that wisdom and creativity and relevance don't automatically diminish just because your hair turns gray or your knees start creaking. In my speech, I talked about the importance of intergenerational dialogue, about how social media could be a bridge instead of a barrier between age groups. I mentioned Marcus specifically, describing how our relationship had evolved from him seeing me as technologically hopeless to us becoming creative collaborators. "My son thought I was too old for social media," I told the audience. But what he really meant was that he'd never seen older adults represented in these spaces in meaningful ways. When I proved that assumption wrong, it didn't just change his view of my capabilities, it expanded his understanding of what aging could look like. The applause was gratifying, but the real validation came afterward, when several audience members approached me to share their own stories of late-life reinvention, of children who'd initially been skeptical but had become their biggest supporters, of discovering that their supposed expiration dates were actually just the beginning of new chapters. I thought about my college poetry journals, about the young woman who'd believed her words could change something in the world. It had taken 35 years, but she'd been right, just not in the way either of us had expected. The story doesn't end with the viral video or the speaking engagements or even the book deal I eventually signed. It ends with the understanding that relevance isn't something that gets granted or revoked by others. It's something you claim for yourself, regardless of what age society thinks you should start fading into the background. Marcus still rolls his eyes occasionally when I ask for his help with technical issues, or when I use slang in ways that make him cringe. But he's also started sharing my videos on his own social media accounts, introducing me to his friends as my mom, the TikTok poet. The embarrassment has transformed into something approaching pride. And when people ask him now about having an internet-famous mother, he's learned to tell the story differently. Instead of focusing on the novelty of someone my age going viral, he talks about what he learned from watching me refuse to accept limitations that other people tried to impose on my potential. "She proved that you're never too old to start something new," he says. And that's pretty cool, actually. 3 weeks after the expiration date hit 2 million views, I discovered that internet fame comes with complications nobody warns you about. My phone had become a constant source of notifications, collaboration requests, interview opportunities, and an endless stream of direct messages that ranged from heartwarming to deeply unsettling. What I wasn't prepared for was how quickly success could turn into a different kind of prison. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed a gray sedan parked across from our house for 3 consecutive days. At first I assumed it belonged to someone visiting the Hendersons next door. But when I mentioned it to Marcus over dinner, his expression shifted from casual interest to genuine concern. "Mom, that's not normal. People have been trying to find out where you live since your video went viral. There are entire Reddit threads dedicated to figuring out which house in Portland belongs to the TikTok poet." He pulled up his laptop and showed me screenshots that made my stomach drop. Someone had analyzed the background of my videos, identified the type of trees in my garden, cross-referenced property records, and narrowed down my location to a 3-block radius. The internet's capacity for amateur detective work was both impressive and terrifying. Users had created detailed analyses of my videos, noting everything from the brand of coffee maker visible in my kitchen to the specific variety of roses in my backyard. One particularly dedicated sleuth, had even identified the paint color on my front door based on a glimpse in a video where I'd briefly stepped outside. "We need to be more careful about what shows up in your backgrounds," Marcus said, his marketing background suddenly proving unexpectedly relevant. "And maybe consider getting some kind of security system. I know it sounds paranoid, but you're not just a random person anymore. You have real visibility, and that comes with real risks." The reality of public attention felt surreal. I'd spent my entire career as a high school teacher, where the most recognition I'd ever received was a small feature in the local newspaper when our drama club won a state competition. Now strangers across the country were analyzing my home, my appearance, my word choices, with an intensity that felt simultaneously flattering and invasive. The gray sedan disappeared after the fourth day, but it was replaced by something potentially more problematic: copycat accounts. Someone in Michigan had created a TikTok profile using a slightly altered version of my name, posting poetry videos that mimicked my style and aesthetic. Another account in Florida was using my actual photos while claiming to be me, complete with a bio that described the fake creator as the original viral grandmother poet. Dealing with impersonators required navigating a bureaucratic maze of platform reporting systems that were clearly designed by people much younger than me. Each social media company had different procedures for verifying authentic accounts and removing fake ones. The process involved submitting identification documents, providing detailed explanations of my content creation process, and waiting for responses that could take weeks. Marcus spent an entire weekend helping me document all the fake accounts and file complaints across multiple platforms. "This is insane," he muttered, screenshotting yet another impersonator who was selling merchandise featuring my poems without permission. "There are like 12 different accounts pretending to be you. Some of them have more followers than your actual account." The intellectual property violations were particularly galling. My most popular poems were being printed on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and wall art sold through various online stores, none of which had sought permission or offered compensation. When I tried to contact these sellers, I discovered that protecting creative work in the digital age required either expensive legal representation or an enormous investment of time and energy that I simply didn't have. But the impersonators and merchandise thieves were minor annoyances compared to the death threats. They started arriving about a month after my biggest video, usually in response to poems that addressed political or social issues. Apparently, a middle-aged woman expressing opinions about healthcare, voting rights, or economic inequality was threatening enough to inspire strangers to send detailed descriptions of violence they wanted to inflict on me. The first threatening message appeared in my Instagram direct messages on a Tuesday morning. It was graphic, specific, and clearly written by someone who'd spent considerable time fantasizing about harming me. I stared at my phone screen, reading and rereading the words, trying to process how my poetry about finding purpose after 50 had inspired this level of hatred. Marcus found me sitting at the kitchen table, still holding my phone, 20 minutes later. "Mom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." When I showed him the message, his face went through the same progression of emotions I'd experienced: confusion, disbelief, then a cold anger that made him look older than his 24 years. "We're reporting this to the police," he said immediately. "And you're not reading your direct messages anymore. I'll screen them first." The police visit was educational in ways I hadn't expected. Officer Martinez, who looked younger than most of my former students, explained that online threats against public figures had become increasingly common, but that didn't make them less serious or less illegal. She walked through our house noting potential security vulnerabilities and recommending simple precautions like motion sensor lights and a doorbell camera. "The reality is that most people who send threatening messages online are cowards who would never act on their threats in person," she explained. "But we take every threat seriously, and you should too. Keep records of everything, don't respond to threatening messages, and trust your instincts if something feels dangerous." The threats continued sporadically over the following weeks. Some were obviously from teenage trolls trying to get a reaction. Others felt more serious. detailed enough to suggest the writers had spent real time researching my background. I developed a routine of forwarding everything to a folder that Marcus monitored, trying to distance myself from the hatred while still maintaining awareness of potential risks. The irony wasn't lost on me that poems about aging, creativity, and finding your voice after 50 were inspiring people to threaten violence against a grandmother in Oregon. It revealed something ugly about how certain segments of society responded to older women who refused to remain invisible and silent. But for every threatening message, there were dozens of supportive ones. Women wrote to share their own stories of late-life reinvention. Younger people described how my videos had changed their relationships with their mothers and grandmothers. Teachers thanked me for representing their profession in a positive light. The community that had formed around my content was overwhelmingly positive, creating a buffer against the negativity that seemed inevitable with any kind of public platform. The positive attention led to opportunities that stretched far beyond social media. A literary agent named Diana Chen had reached out after the expiration date went viral, interested in representing me for a potential book deal. Our first phone conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from my teaching background to my thoughts on contemporary poetry, to my vision for how my work might translate to a longer format. There's definitely a market for your voice, Rebecca explained. Publishers are increasingly interested in books that bridge generational gaps, especially ones that challenge assumptions about aging and creativity. Your social media following proves there's an audience hungry for this kind of content. The book proposal process was unlike anything I'd experienced. Rebecca guided me through creating a detailed outline, writing sample chapters, and developing a marketing strategy that leveraged my existing platform while expanding into traditional media. The proposal packet was over 50 pages long, covering everything from target demographics to comparable titles to my plans for promoting the finished book. 3 publishers expressed serious interest, leading to what Rebecca called an auction, where they competed with increasingly attractive offers. The winner was a mid-sized publisher in New York that specialized in memoirs and cultural criticism. They offered an advance that was modest by celebrity standards but life-changing for a retired teacher, enough to pay off my mortgage and provide financial security for several years. The contract negotiation revealed aspects of publishing that I'd never considered. Beyond the basic advance and royalty structure, there were clauses about film rights, international translations, audiobook production, and digital distribution. Rebecca walked me through each section, explaining how seemingly minor details could have major implications for my future earnings and creative control. Signing the contract felt like crossing a threshold into a completely different kind of professional life. I was no longer just a viral content creator or a retired teacher, experimenting with social media. I was officially an author, with all the responsibilities and opportunities that designation implied. The writing process proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. Expanding 30-second poetry videos into a full-length book required developing themes and narratives in ways I hadn't needed to consider for social media. My editor, Sarah Kim, pushed me to dig deeper into the personal experiences behind my poems, to provide context and reflection that would give readers a fuller understanding of my journey. Your TikTok audience already knows and loves your voice, Sarah explained during one of our early conversations. But book readers need more. They want to understand not just what you think, but how you came to think it. They want the story behind the story. This meant revisiting painful periods of my life in greater detail than I'd ever shared publicly. My divorce from Marcus's father, the loneliness and identity crisis that followed my retirement, the years of feeling invisible and irrelevant before discovering social media as a creative outlet. Writing about these experiences required a level of vulnerability that felt both liberating and terrifying. Marcus watched this process with interest and occasional concern. He'd find me at my laptop at odd hours, wrestling with a particularly difficult chapter, or trying to find the right words to describe an emotional turning point. Sometimes he'd read drafts and offer feedback, bringing his generational perspective to stories about experiences he'd witnessed but never fully understood. "I never realized how hard the divorce was on you," he said after reading a chapter about rebuilding my identity as a single woman in my late 40s. I was 16, so I was pretty wrapped up in my own drama. But reading this, I can see how much you were struggling while trying to keep everything normal for me. These conversations deepened our relationship in unexpected ways. The book wasn't just documenting my journey. It was creating opportunities for Marcus and me to discuss family history with an honesty we'd never achieved before. He began sharing his own memories of that period, filling in gaps in my understanding of how my struggles had affected him. The writing also connected me with other authors navigating similar territory. Through my publisher, I met women who'd written about divorce after 50, career changes in midlife, and the challenges of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. We formed an informal support network, sharing strategies for handling difficult topics and celebrating each other's progress. One particularly meaningful connection was with Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who'd written extensively about women's identity development in later life. She reached out after reading an early excerpt from my book that had been published in a literary magazine. Her research on post-reproductive creativity provided academic context for phenomena I'd experienced intuitively. What you're describing in your work aligns perfectly with recent research about creativity and aging, she explained during a video call. There's significant data showing that many women experience a surge in creative energy and willingness to take risks after 50. Society treats this as anomalous, but it's actually quite common and predictable. Patricia's research helped me understand my own experience as part of a larger pattern, rather than an isolated personal journey. Women who'd spent decades prioritizing others' needs often rediscovered suppressed aspects of their personalities once those caregiving responsibilities diminished. The empty nest syndrome that was typically framed as loss could also represent liberation. This academic perspective enriched my writing, providing broader context for personal anecdotes and challenging readers to reconsider their assumptions about aging and creativity. Instead of just sharing my story, I was contributing to a larger cultural conversation about how society understands and supports women's development across the lifespan. The book deadline created a new kind of pressure in my life. Social media content could be created spontaneously, posted immediately, and revised through subsequent videos. Book writing required sustained focus, careful planning, and the knowledge that once published, the words would be permanently fixed in that form. There were no opportunities for clarification or correction beyond formal errata. This permanence was both intimidating and motivating. Every sentence needed to be considered more carefully than a TikTok caption. Every anecdote required fact-checking and sensitivity review. I found myself second-guessing decisions about how much personal detail to include, whether certain stories might hurt people I cared about, and how to balance honesty with privacy. The most challenging sections dealt with my relationship with Marcus during his teenage years and early 20s. Writing about our conflicts, his struggles with direction after college, and my own parental anxieties required his consent and input. We spent several long evenings discussing which stories he was comfortable having me share, and how to present his perspective fairly. "I don't want to come across as the ungrateful son who didn't appreciate his mother," he said, reviewing a chapter about his initial reaction to my social media presence. "But I also want people to understand why I reacted that way. It wasn't just about being embarrassed. I genuinely didn't understand what you were trying to accomplish." His willingness to be vulnerable in service of my book project was touching and mature in ways that surprised me. He suggested edits that made his younger self more sympathetic while acknowledging his mistakes. The collaborative process of crafting these sections strengthened our relationship while producing more nuanced, honest writing. As my book deadline approached, my social media presence evolved to incorporate updates about the writing process. Followers became invested in my progress, offering encouragement during difficult writing days and celebrating milestones like completing first drafts and surviving editorial feedback. This audience investment created additional pressure to produce something worthy of their support. The intersection between my online platform and traditional publishing created opportunities and complications I hadn't anticipated. Publishers expected authors to leverage social media for book promotion, but they also wanted to maintain control over marketing messages and timing. Balancing my authentic voice with promotional requirements required constant negotiation. My editor suggested posting behind-the-scenes content about the writing process, photos of my workspace, quotes from difficult chapters, reflections on the emotional challenges of memoir writing. This content performed well with my audience, but it also meant that every aspect of my creative process was becoming public performance rather than private reflection. The business side of being an author proved more complex than I'd expected. Beyond writing the book, I needed to participate in marketing planning, coordinate with publicists, prepare for interviews, and develop a tour schedule that balanced promotional effectiveness with my personal comfort level. Rebecca guided me through these decisions, but ultimately, I needed to make choices about how much of my privacy and schedule to sacrifice for book promotion. The financial realities were also more complicated than the initial advance had suggested. Authors are responsible for their own taxes, publicity expenses, and promotional activities. The advance was paid in installments tied to manuscript delivery and publication dates, requiring careful budgeting to ensure I could support myself throughout the process. Marcus proved invaluable in helping me navigate these business aspects. His marketing background and generational familiarity with digital promotion made him an ideal advisor for social media strategy and audience development. He created spreadsheets tracking my follower growth across platforms, analyzed engagement rates for different types of content, and suggested collaborations with other creators that could expand my reach. "You need to think about this more strategically, Mom," he said, reviewing my content calendar. "You have a book coming out in 6 months. Every video you post between now and then should be building anticipation or establishing your expertise on the themes you're writing about." This strategic approach felt foreign after months of creating content spontaneously based on whatever I was thinking about or experiencing. But Marcus was right that successful book launches required coordinated marketing efforts that began long before publication dates. My social media presence needed to evolve from personal expression to professional platform. The transformation wasn't entirely comfortable. Audiences could sense when content was created primarily for promotional purposes, rather than authentic sharing. I needed to find ways to maintain my genuine voice while also supporting my book's commercial success. The balance required constant adjustment and considerable trial and error. 6 months before my book's publication date, I received an email that changed everything. An invitation to speak at South by Southwest, the massive annual conference in Austin that brings together technology, media, and creative professionals from around the world. The speaking fee was substantial, but more importantly, the platform would introduce my work to industry leaders who could open doors I didn't even know existed. The invitation came through a speaking bureau that had discovered my work through social media. They specialized in representing unconventional thought leaders, people who'd gained expertise and platforms outside traditional academic or corporate pathways. My story of late-life reinvention through digital creativity apparently fit their roster perfectly. Preparing for South by Southwest required developing a presentation that would resonate with an audience of technology professionals, media executives, and creative entrepreneurs. Most attendees would be decades younger than me, working in industries I barely understood, facing challenges completely different from those I'd encountered in education. But the core themes of my work, authenticity, resilience, challenging assumptions, finding your voice, were universally relevant. I spent weeks crafting a presentation that used my personal story to illustrate broader principles about creativity, aging, and the democratizing potential of social media platforms. The title of my talk was, "The Algorithm Doesn't Care How Old You Are: What Traditional Media Can Learn from Unlikely Viral Stars." I plan to discuss how social media success depends more on authentic voice and consistent value creation than on conventional demographic advantages. Marcus helped me prepare by conducting practice sessions where he played the role of skeptical audience member, asking challenging questions about the sustainability of my success and the broader applicability of my experience. These rehearsals revealed gaps in my arguments and helped me anticipate potential criticism. Remember, a lot of people in that audience make money by perpetuating the idea that successful content creation requires expensive production, sophisticated strategy, and professional teams. He warned. Your story challenges those assumptions, which some people might find threatening to their business models. This perspective helped me frame my presentation not just as personal memoir, but as a case study in how authentic content could outperform highly produced material when it addressed real audience needs. My success wasn't just about age-defying expectations. It was about connecting with underserved audiences that traditional media had overlooked. The weeks leading up to South by Southwest were filled with final book edits, social media content creation, and presentation rehearsals. I was simultaneously excited about the opportunities and anxious about performing at such a high-profile event. The imposter syndrome that had followed me throughout this journey intensified as the conference date approached. But I also felt a deep sense of gratitude for how dramatically my life had changed in such a short period. 18 months earlier, I'd been a recently retired teacher wondering what to do with the rest of my life. Now, I was a published author, viral content creator, and keynote speaker at one of the world's most influential creative conferences. The transformation hadn't been without costs. My privacy was gone, my daily routine was completely disrupted, and I'd had to develop entirely new skills in areas I'd never considered relevant to my life. But the gains far outweighed the losses. I'd found my voice, built a community, and proven to myself and others that reinvention was possible at any age. Most importantly, my relationship with Marcus had evolved from him seeing me as an increasingly irrelevant fixture in his life to viewing me as a creative collaborator and source of inspiration. When he introduced me to his friends now, it was with obvious pride rather than resigned obligation. "This is my mom," he'd say. "She's the one who went viral on TikTok and wrote the book about aging and creativity. She's basically famous now, which is still weird for me but also pretty cool." The journey from "you're too old for social media, mom" to "she's basically famous now" had taken less than 2 years, but more than external validation. What mattered was the internal transformation, from seeing myself as someone whose best years were behind her to recognizing that I was just getting started. Standing in my kitchen the morning before leaving for Austin, I looked around at the space where this entire adventure had begun. The same countertops where Marcus had rolled his eyes at my early TikTok attempts, the same window that had provided natural lighting for hundreds of videos, the same table where I'd written most of my book. Nothing in the physical environment had changed, but everything else was different. I was different. And as I packed my suitcase for South by Southwest, I realized that this was just the beginning of whatever came next. Walking onto the South by Southwest stage in Austin, I felt the weight of 1,500 pairs of eyes on me. The audience was exactly what I'd expected. Predominantly male, predominantly under 40, predominantly skeptical about what a 58-year-old retired teacher from Oregon could possibly teach them about digital innovation. Their polite but cautious applause suggested they were reserving judgment until I proved I belonged on that stage. 6 months ago, my son told me I was too old for social media, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the convention center's sound system. Today, that same son is backstage managing my speaker writer and negotiating my next collaboration deals. The audience stirred with interest. Marcus had indeed flown down to Austin with me, transforming from reluctant social media advisor to full-fledged business partner. His marketing background and digital native instincts complemented my creative voice perfectly, creating a mother-son team that neither of us had seen coming. My presentation walked through the key principles I'd learned about authentic content creation, using specific examples from my most successful videos to illustrate broader points about audience connection and algorithmic success. I discussed the mythology around viral content, that it required perfect timing, expensive production, or demographic advantages, and demonstrated how genuine voice and consistent value could overcome traditional barriers. The breakthrough moment came when I addressed the elephant in the room directly. You're wondering if my success was a fluke, if age-based novelty was the real driver of my viral moments. Let me show you the data. Marcus had helped me compile analytics that proved the staying power of my content. While initial videos might have gained traction partly due to their unexpected demographic source, sustained growth came from repeat viewers, genuine engagement, and measurable impact on audience behavior. My followers weren't just consuming content. They were changing their own lives based on what they learned from my journey. The algorithm doesn't care about your age, your background, or your conventional credentials, I continued. It cares about whether you're providing something valuable to an underserved audience. And in my case, that audience was millions of women over 40 who'd been invisible to most content creators and advertisers. The questions during the panel discussion were sharp but respectful. Tech executives wanted to understand how platforms could better serve older demographics. Marketing professionals asked about authentic brand partnerships with unconventional influencers. Creative directors inquired about translating viral success into sustainable long-term careers. One particularly insightful question came from a woman about my age in the audience. How do you maintain authenticity when success requires increasingly strategic content planning? This touched on the central tension I'd been navigating since my follower count exploded. The moment you start creating content primarily to chase metrics rather than to share something meaningful, your audience notices. I replied, authenticity isn't about being spontaneous. It's about being genuinely invested in providing value to people who trust you with their time and attention. After the presentation, the networking sessions were eye-opening. Venture capitalists discussed investment opportunities in platforms and tools designed for older users. Publishers talked about the growing market for books addressing midlife transitions. Brand managers wanted to understand how to reach mature consumers without condescending to them. Most surprisingly, several young entrepreneurs approached me about advisory roles in their startups. They recognized that their products needed perspectives from demographics they didn't understand, and my journey had demonstrated the commercial potential of audiences they'd been overlooking. We're developing a platform for creative professionals over 50, explained Diana Chen, a 28-year-old founder from San Francisco. But our entire team is under 35. We keep building features that we think older users want, but we have no idea if we're actually solving real problems or just stereotyping. I agreed to consult on her project, marking my entry into the tech advisory world, another career path I'd never anticipated. Within weeks of returning from Austin, I had similar offers from companies developing everything from health apps to financial services platforms, all recognizing that the baby boomer and Generation X markets represented enormous opportunities they were failing to capture effectively. The book launched 3 months later exceeded everyone's expectations. Never Too Late, Finding Your Voice After 50, debuted at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. Driven partly by my social media following, but sustained by word-of-mouth recommendations from readers who saw their own stories reflected in my experiences. The promotional tour was grueling, but exhilarating. Morning show interviews, podcast appearances, bookstore readings, and library speaking engagements created a schedule that would have exhausted my 20-year-old self. At 58, I found the energy for it because every event connected me with people who needed to hear that reinvention was possible at any stage of life. The most memorable event was a reading at Powell's Books in Portland, my hometown independent bookstore where I'd been a customer for decades. The audience filled the main reading room and spilled into adjacent areas, with people of all ages but a strong representation of women over 45. During the question period, a woman about my age stood up and said, "I've been writing poetry for 30 years but never shared it with anyone. Your book made me realize I've been waiting for permission that nobody else can give me." The applause that followed was the most meaningful of my entire tour, but success brought unexpected challenges beyond the logistics of a busy schedule. Family dynamics shifted in ways that required constant navigation. My elderly mother, who'd originally suggested I try social media, now felt overshadowed by my public presence. Extended family members who'd barely maintained contact suddenly wanted to reconnect, often with suggestions for how I could help promote their own projects or businesses. Most difficult was managing the relationship with my ex-husband, Marcus's father, who'd been largely absent from our lives since the divorce 8 years earlier. My public success had apparently reminded him of our family's existence, leading to awkward attempts at reconciliation that seemed motivated more by opportunism than genuine remorse. He called me yesterday asking if you might mention his consulting business in one of your videos. Marcus reported after one particularly frustrating conversation with his father. I told him that wasn't how any of this works, but he doesn't seem to understand that your platform isn't a free advertising service for people who treated you badly. These situations required setting boundaries I'd never needed to establish before. Public visibility meant that every relationship in my life suddenly had potential commercial or reputational implications. Learning to say no gracefully while maintaining important personal connections became an essential skill. The financial benefits of success were real but complicated. Book royalties, speaking fees, brand partnerships, and consulting contracts provided more income than I'd earned during my highest-paid teaching years. However, the irregular nature of this income required completely different financial planning than the steady salary I'd grown accustomed to over 3 decades in education. Marcus proved invaluable in helping me understand and manage these new revenue streams. His generation's familiarity with freelance income, quarterly tax payments, and diverse income sources made him better equipped than me to navigate the business side of creative careers. "You need to think about this like a small business owner, not like an employee," he explained, helping me set up separate accounts for different income streams and plan for the inevitable fluctuations in creative industry earnings. "Some months will be great, others will be slow. The key is building reserves during good periods to carry you through quieter times." This business education extended to understanding intellectual property rights, contract negotiations, and the complex ecosystem of agents, publishers, speaking bureaus, and brand partnership networks that surrounded successful content creators. Each new opportunity required evaluating not just immediate financial benefits, but long-term implications for my personal brand and audience relationships. The most gratifying development was watching how my success inspired other women to take creative risks they'd been postponing. My social media mentions regularly included posts from followers who'd started their own TikTok accounts, enrolled in creative writing classes, launched small businesses, or simply begun sharing their expertise more confidently in their existing careers. "Your videos gave me permission to stop waiting for someday," wrote one follower who'd started a pottery studio at age 62. "I kept thinking I'd pursue my art when I had more time, more money, more confidence. But watching you start from zero and build something meaningful made me realize that someday was actually today." These responses reinforced that my story's value extended far beyond entertainment or personal validation. I was contributing to a cultural shift in how society viewed aging, creativity, and the possibility of significant life changes after traditional career peaks. The speaking engagement requests evolved from conferences focused on social media and marketing to events addressing broader themes of reinvention, resilience, and challenging age-based assumptions. Corporate leadership programs wanted me to discuss career transitions. Universities invited me to speak about lifelong learning. Healthcare organizations sought presentations about maintaining purpose and identity through life changes. Each speaking opportunity required adapting my core message to different audiences while maintaining the authenticity that had driven my original success. Tech conferences needed different examples and language than healthcare symposiums, but the underlying principles remained consistent: genuine voice, persistent effort, and willingness to ignore people who try to limit your potential based on their narrow assumptions. The most unexpected invitation came from the Oregon Department of Education, asking me to keynote their annual conference on innovative teaching methods. Standing before an audience of current educators, I reflected on how my post-teaching career had actually enhanced, rather than replaced, my educational impact. "I'm reaching more people now with lessons about creativity, resilience, and self-advocacy than I ever did in a traditional classroom," I told the assembled teachers. "The platforms change, but the fundamental work of helping people discover and develop their potential remains the same." Marcus watched my transformation with a mixture of pride and amusement that had become our new normal. His initial embarrassment about my social media presence had evolved into genuine respect for my work ethic and business acumen. More importantly, our relationship had shifted from him tolerating my attempts to stay relevant to us collaborating as equals on projects that mattered to both of us. "I used to think you were trying to be something you weren't," he admitted during one of our regular business planning sessions. "But now I realize you were becoming something you'd always been but hadn't had the opportunity to express fully." This insight captured something essential about the entire journey. My viral success wasn't about transforming into a completely different person. It was about finally having the platform, confidence, and freedom to share aspects of myself that had been suppressed during decades of focusing primarily on other people's needs and expectations. The 18 months since "You're Too Old for Social Media, Mom" had proven that age was far less relevant than authenticity, persistence, and willingness to ignore people who tried to impose limitations based on their own narrow understanding of possibility. My story wasn't unique because I'd succeeded despite my age. It was significant because it demonstrated how many people were succeeding once society stopped defining their expiration dates for them. Standing in my kitchen now, the same space where this entire adventure had begun, I looked at the evidence of how much had changed. Business contracts on the counter where grocery lists used to sit. A professional lighting setup in the corner where houseplants once gathered dust. Most importantly, a relationship with my son that had evolved from him being embarrassed by my digital experiments to him being my trusted business partner and closest advisor. The gray sedan was gone from across the street, replaced by genuine fans who occasionally stopped to take selfies with the house that had served as backdrop for hundreds of videos. The death threats had largely stopped, overwhelmed by the volume of supportive messages from people whose lives had been touched by the story of a teacher who refused to accept that her most important chapters were behind her. Marcus found me there, scrolling through messages from tomorrow's speaking engagement coordinators, reviewing contracts for next month's brand partnerships, and planning content for the week ahead. The boy who'd once rolled his eyes at my 47 TikTok followers was now helping me manage a platform that reached millions of people across multiple countries and languages. "Ready for tomorrow's interview?" he asked, referencing the morning show appearance where I'd be discussing the paperback release of my book and announcing my next project, a documentary about late-life creativity featuring women who'd found their voices after 50. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, closing my laptop and looking around the kitchen that had accidentally become the launching pad for a career I'd never imagined possible. The journey from reluctant retiree to viral sensation to published author to business owner had taken less than 2 years. But more than any external achievement, what mattered was the internal transformation from accepting other people's limitations to defining my own possibilities. And as I prepared for whatever came next, I knew that the most important lesson wasn't about social media algorithms or viral content strategies. It was about the power of refusing to accept that your story is finished, just because someone else thinks you're too old to start a new chapter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.